The thermos burned warm against Margaret's palms as she pressed closer to the frost-etched window. 7:30 p.m., same as always. The girl would appear any moment now, materializing from the swirling snow like some tragic fairy tale come to life. Margaret's kitchen occupied the corner of what had once been Millbrook's bustling downtown district. Now, boarded storefronts lined the street like missing teeth, and the old Carnegie Library stood empty, its windows dark as dead eyes. The steel mill's closure 15 years ago had gutted the town, leaving behind only the desperate, the stubborn, and those with nowhere else to go. Margaret supposed she fell into all three categories. The diner had belonged to her late husband Frank, back when it served hearty breakfasts to mill workers starting their shifts at dawn. These days, she kept the lights on 3 evenings a week, ladling out free meals to anyone who needed them. The irony wasn't lost on her. After decades of navigating bureaucracy and red tape, she'd finally found a way to help people that required no case files, no court orders, no supervisors questioning her judgment. A pale shape moved beyond the amber circle of the streetlight. Margaret's breath fogged the glass as she leaned forward. There, emerging from the alley between Murphy's defunct hardware store and the old barber shop, came the girl. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older, her thin frame bundled in a coat that had probably been blue once, but now appeared grey as everything else in this dying town. The child's hair caught the light from the street lamp, revealing those impossible silver streaks that made Margaret's chest tighten every time she saw them. No child should have grey hair. No child should move with such bone-deep weariness, as if the weight of the world rested on shoulders that couldn't be more than 7 years old. Margaret grabbed the thermos and hurried to the back door, her joints protesting the sudden movement. 62 felt much older when winter settled into your bones and refused to leave. She flicked on the exterior light and opened the door just as small knuckles rapped against the metal frame. "Good evening, ma'am." The girl's voice carried the formal cadence Margaret had noticed from their first encounter 3 weeks ago. "I'm sorry to bother you again." "No bother at all, sweetheart." Margaret crouched to the child's eye level, studying the pale face beneath the wet hood. Dark circles shadowed eyes that seemed far too knowing. "How's your mother feeling tonight?" "Still poorly, I'm afraid." The girl's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. "She can't keep much down, but soup might help. If you have any to spare." Margaret held out the thermos, watching as thin fingers wrapped around the metal container with reverent care. The girl's hands were red with cold, her worn mittens more whole than fabric. No child should be out in this weather, especially not alone. "What's your name, honey?" Margaret had asked this question before, but the girl always found ways to deflect. "Thank you for your kindness." The child tucked the thermos inside her coat. "Mama says there aren't many good people left in the world." "Your mama's not wrong about that." Margaret's social worker instincts kicked into high gear, but she might feel better if she saw a doctor. "I could help arrange." "Oh, no, ma'am. Mama doesn't trust doctors." The girl stepped backward into the shadows. "But she's grateful for the food. We both are." Margaret stood slowly, her knees creaking in protest. "Wait. At least tell me where you live. I could bring groceries, maybe some medicine." But the girl was already retreating into the storm, her small figure growing indistinct against the whirling snow. Margaret grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped into the brutal cold, her shoes sliding on the ice-slicked pavement. "Honey, wait!" The wind swallowed her words. Margaret hurried toward the alley where the girl had disappeared, but by the time she reached the narrow passage between buildings, she found only her own footprints in the fresh snow. The alley dead-ended at a brick wall covered in decades of rust stains and graffiti. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her breath coming in sharp puffs as she studied the undisturbed snow beyond her own tracks. This was the 3rd time she'd lost the girl in this same spot. 3 times she'd watched a child vanish into an alley that led nowhere. She pulled her coat tighter and trudged back to the diner, her mind churning with possibilities she didn't want to examine too closely. Inside, she locked the door and turned off the lights, but sleep would evade her tonight. same as always. In her small apartment above the diner, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a manila folder she'd sworn never to open again. Emma Pritchard's case file lay before her, 35 years old and still bleeding guilt onto her conscience. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The grey-streaked hair, the formal manner of speaking, the way the child's eyes held secrets too heavy for someone so young. Outside, the blizzard raged on, and Margaret wondered if some debts could ever truly be forgiven. Margaret's alarm pierced the grey dawn at 5:30, same as it had every morning for the past 3 years. She'd stopped using the snooze button after Frank died. There seemed little point in delaying the inevitable march of empty hours. The case file still lay open on her kitchen table where she'd left it, Emma Pritchard's school photo staring up at her with eyes that held too much knowledge for a 7-year-old. She closed the folder with shaking hands and shoved it back into the drawer where it belonged. The apartment above the diner felt smaller each day, cluttered with the detritus of 2 lives compressed into one. Frank's reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside his favorite mystery novel, bookmark marking a page he'd never finish. His coffee mug, the one that read "World's Best Cook" in faded blue letters, remained in the dish drainer, where she'd placed it after washing it one final time. She couldn't bring herself to use it, couldn't bear to put it away. Margaret showered quickly in the cramped bathroom, avoiding her reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. The woman who stared back these days looked every one of her 62 years, with deep lines carved by 3 decades of removing children from homes that should have been sanctuaries. Grey streaked her brown hair, not the premature silver that haunted the mysterious girl, but the earned pewter of someone who'd seen too much and saved too little. By 7 a.m., she was downstairs preparing for the morning crowd. Not that crowds existed anymore in Millbrook. On a good day, she might serve 15 people, mostly seniors on fixed incomes who appreciated the sliding scale prices and a few construction workers from the highway project 20 miles south. The coffee was strong, the portions generous, and Margaret never asked questions when someone came up short on the check. The bell above the door chimed at 7:15, announcing her first customer. Dorothy Brennan shuffled in, her walker leaving wet tracks on the linoleum. At 78, Dorothy was Margaret's closest friend and harshest critic, a former librarian who'd watched their town slowly bleed out after the mill closure. "Storm's getting worse," Dorothy announced, settling into her usual booth by the window. "Radio says another 6 inches before noon." Margaret poured coffee without being asked, the routine as comfortable as breathing. "You shouldn't be out walking in this weather, Dot. It shouldn't be a lot of things at my age, but here we are." Dorothy's sharp eyes studied Margaret's face. "You look like hell warmed over. That girl show up again last night?" Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. She'd made the mistake of mentioning the mysterious child to Dorothy last week, framing it as concern for a local family in need. Dorothy's librarian instincts had kicked in immediately. She'd started asking questions Margaret couldn't answer. She did. Margaret slid into the opposite side of the booth. "3rd time she's vanished in that dead-end alley. It doesn't make sense, Dot. Lot of things don't make sense these days." Dorothy stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe she's slipping through one of those basement windows. Old Murphy used to have storage space that connected to the barber shop. Maybe." But Margaret knew what she'd seen, or thought she'd seen. The undisturbed snow, the impossible disappearance, the way the girl seemed to materialize from nowhere. "I keep thinking I should call social services." Dorothy's laugh held no humor. "Social services? Honey, you know better than anyone what a joke that is. Besides, you've been out of that game for 35 years. 35 years. The same amount of time since Emma Pritchard vanished." The bell chimed again, admitting Ray Kowalski in a blast of frigid air. The retired mill foreman stamped his feet and headed for his corner stool at the counter, nodding to both women. Ray had been coming here since Frank's time, had probably consumed more coffee in this diner than water. He ordered the same thing every morning, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, hash browns, and left exactly the same tip, $2.37. Margaret rose to pour his coffee. grateful for the interruption. Ray didn't talk much, which suited her fine. His presence filled the silence without demanding conversation, unlike Dorothy's persistent questions about the mysterious girl. As the morning wore on, a few more regulars drifted in and out. Mrs. Chen from the corner market, picking up coffee and a muffin before opening her store. Tommy Walsh, whose disability check allowed him one restaurant meal per week, always choosing Tuesday breakfast at Margaret's kitchen. Father Mackenzie from St. Mary's, who came by every few days to quietly inquire whether Margaret needed anything. His subtle way of checking on her well-being. Each interaction felt rehearsed, comfortable in its predictability. These people depended on her, on this small pocket of warmth in their dying town. The diner represented continuity, stability, proof that some things endured even when everything else crumbled. But as Margaret wiped down tables and refilled coffee cups, she couldn't shake the image of that pale girl disappearing into impossible spaces, carrying soup to a mother who might not exist. The rational part of her mind, the part trained to assess situations and protect children, insisted she was experiencing stress-induced hallucinations, guilt manifesting as ghostly encounters. The other part, the part that had learned to trust instincts over evidence, whispered that some mysteries demanded investigation, no matter how impossible they seemed. Outside, snow continued falling on Millbrook's empty streets, covering everything in pristine white that would soon turn grey with neglect. The disruption came at 11:47 a.m., just as Margaret was wiping down the last of the breakfast dishes. The bell above the door chimed, admitting not one of her usual customers but a stranger, a woman in her 40s wearing a crisp navy coat that screamed government authority. She carried herself with the purposeful stride Margaret recognized from her own decades, navigating bureaucratic hallways. "Mrs. Holloway?" The woman approached the counter, snow melting from her shoulders. "I'm Detective Sarah Chen from the Pennsylvania State Police. Could we talk?" Margaret's hands stilled on the coffee pot. Police meant questions, and questions meant exposure of secrets she'd buried deeper than winter frost. "What's this about? Missing persons case. I understand you run a soup kitchen here evenings." The coffee pot slipped, clattering against the counter. Margaret caught it before it fell, her social worker instinct screaming danger. "Some evenings, yes. Why?" Detective Chen pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a marked page. "We've had reports of a young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, seen in this area after dark, pale, thin, wearing an old blue coat, dark hair with premature grey streaks." The description hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the counter to steady herself. "Reports from who?" "Anonymous tip came in yesterday. Caller said they'd seen a child matching this description multiple times near your establishment, always alone, always at night." Chen's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Thing is, Mrs. Holloway, this description matches a girl who disappeared 35 years ago. Emma Pritchard." The name hung in the air between them like a curse. Margaret's vision tunneled, the familiar guilt crushing down on her chest. She'd spent decades trying to forget that name, that case, that failure. I knew Emma." The words came out as a whisper. "I was her caseworker." "I know." Chen closed the notebook. "That's why I'm here. The Pritchard case was never officially closed. Emma and her mother vanished during the blizzard of '87, but no bodies were ever found. The file says you'd been monitoring the situation for possible removal." Margaret's legs gave out. She sank onto the stool behind the counter, memories flooding back with brutal clarity. The bruises on Emma's arms that her mother Diane explained as clumsiness. The child's formal way of speaking, as if afraid casual words might trigger violence. The emergency visit Margaret had scheduled for the day after the blizzard hit, a visit that came too late. "Mrs. Holloway?" Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" "The girl you described," Margaret managed. "She's been coming here, 3 weeks now, always asking for soup for her sick mother." Chen leaned forward, suddenly intense. "You've seen her? Recently?" "Last night." Margaret stopped, realizing how insane it would sound. How could she explain the vanishing act, the undisturbed snow, the impossible appearances? She comes for food, then disappears into the alley. I can never follow her. What alley? Between Murphy's old hardware store and the barber shop. But it's a dead end, detective. There's nowhere to go. Chen was already moving toward the door. Show me. Outside, the snowfall had intensified, turning the world into a white void. Margaret led the detective to the alley mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment when her careful isolation would crumble, when questions she couldn't answer would destroy the small peace she'd built. The alley stretched before them, narrow and grimy, ending at the same brick wall Margaret had stared at countless times. But today, something was different. Today, there were footprints in the snow, small, child-sized impressions leading straight to the wall and then stopping. Chen knelt beside the tracks, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. These are fresh, maybe an hour old. That's impossible. Margaret stared at the prints. I've been in the diner all morning. No one came through. The detective stood, brushing snow from her knees. Her expression had shifted from professional interest to something approaching alarm. Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you directly. Do you believe you're seeing Emma Pritchard? The question hung between them like a blade. Margaret looked at the impossible footprints, at the dead-end alley, at the detective whose presence had just shattered her carefully maintained ordinary world. She thought about Emma's case file hidden in her drawer, about guilt that followed her through decades of sleepless nights, about a pale girl who appeared from nowhere carrying soup to a mother who might not exist. She had a choice to make. She could lie, claim stress and hallucinations, send the detective away and return to her safe routine of coffee and small kindnesses. Or she could speak the truth that would sound like madness, that the child she'd failed to save 3 decades ago was somehow still out there in the snow, still hungry, still protecting a mother who couldn't protect her. Margaret looked into Detective Chen's waiting eyes and made her decision. Yes, she whispered. I think I am. Detective Chen stared at Margaret for a long moment, snow accumulating on both their shoulders as the wind howled through the alley. Margaret immediately regretted her admission, the words hanging in the frigid air like an indictment of her sanity. Mrs. Holloway, Chen said carefully, I think we should continue this conversation inside. Back in the diner's warmth, Margaret poured coffee with shaking hands while Chen sat in Dorothy's usual booth, studying her with the measured gaze of someone trained to distinguish truth from delusion. The detective hadn't fled or called for psychiatric evaluation, which somehow made everything worse. Margaret had expected dismissal, not this careful attention. Tell me about the original case, Chen said. Your file notes were minimal. Margaret's throat constricted. She'd kept those notes sparse deliberately, trying to protect herself from the full weight of her failure. The Pritchards lived in the trailer park on Elm Street. Diane was a single mother, worked nights at the truck stop when she could find shifts. Emma was... Margaret paused, remembering. Emma was old beyond her years, too quiet, too careful. She spoke like she'd been coached on exactly what to say. Signs of abuse? Nothing concrete enough for emergency removal. The familiar self-recrimination burned in Margaret's chest. Bruises that could have been accidents. A child who flinched when adults moved too quickly. Diane's boyfriend, Carl Brennan, had a record for domestic violence, but Emma always insisted he was kind to her. Chen made notes. You scheduled a follow-up visit? For January 15th, 1987. But the blizzard hit January 14th. Margaret closed her eyes, reliving that terrible morning when she'd called the Pritchard trailer and gotten only silence. 26 inches of snow in 18 hours. Roads were impassable for 3 days. And when you finally reached the trailer? Gone. The word came out flat, emotionless. Margaret had practiced delivering this information without breaking down, first to her supervisor, then to investigators, finally to herself in sleepless 3 a.m. confessions. No forwarding address, no trace of where they'd gone. Carl's truck was missing too. Everyone assumed he'd taken them somewhere before the storm hit. But Chen was shaking her head. Carl Brennan was found dead in his truck on January 16, 1987, crashed into a tree on Route 43, about 5 miles from the trailer park. He'd been drinking. He was alone. The coffee cup slipped from Margaret's fingers, shattering against the floor. Hot liquid splashed across her shoes, but she barely noticed. Alone? No sign of Diane or Emma. No evidence they'd ever been in that truck. Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Holloway, officially. Emma and her mother disappeared without a trace. But there were always questions. Margaret knelt to clean up the broken ceramic, using the mundane task to steady herself. Carl dead, alone, drunk, while Diane and Emma vanished into a blizzard. Where could they have gone? How could a woman with no car, no money, and a 7-year-old child simply disappear? What kind of questions? She asked. Neighbors heard screaming from the trailer the night before the storm, loud arguing, sounds of violence, then silence. Chen paused. The theory was that Carl killed them before he left, disposed of the bodies somewhere between the trailer park and where he crashed. Margaret's hands stilled on the towel, but no bodies were found. 50 square miles of forest and abandoned mine shafts. Perfect place to hide evidence, especially with a blizzard covering tracks. Chen's voice softened. Mrs. Holloway, everyone involved in that investigation, believed Emma Pritchard died 35 years ago. The weight of those words settled over Margaret like a shroud. If Emma was dead, had been dead for decades, then what had she been seeing? Stress-induced hallucinations made sense, guilt manifesting as ghostly encounters. The rational explanation that would let her return to her careful routine. But the footprints had been real. Chen had seen them too. "I know how this sounds," Margaret said, still kneeling on the floor with ceramic shards scattered around her. "I know what it means if I'm seeing a dead child. Either I'm losing my mind or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Or what, Mrs. Holloway?" Margaret looked up at the detective, this stranger who'd walked into her safe world and shattered it with questions about cases that should have stayed buried. Part of her wanted to take back her admission, claim confusion and stress, send Chen away and return to serving coffee and avoiding the truth. But Emma's face haunted her. Not the school photo from the case file, but the pale, grey-streaked girl who appeared from nowhere, carrying soup to a mother who might not exist. A child still trying to take care of someone, still hungry, still alone in the cold. "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "But she keeps coming back, and I keep failing her." Outside, the storm continued its assault on Millbrook, burying the past deeper, while somehow bringing it closer to the surface. Detective Chen sat forward in the booth, her notepad forgotten on the table. "Mrs. Holloway, what if you're not failing her? What if she's trying to tell you something?" Margaret remained kneeling among the broken ceramic, the detective's words hitting her like a revelation. All these weeks, she'd been thinking about the girl's appearances as her own guilt-induced torment. But what if Emma, dead or alive, real or spirit, had her own purpose? "Tell me something," Margaret said slowly. "The neighbors who heard screaming that night, were they interviewed thoroughly?" Chen nodded. "Standard procedure. But you know how it is in small towns. People see what they want to see, remember what feels safe to remember." Margaret knew. She'd spent 35 years in social work navigating the complex web of willful blindness that protected abusers and failed children. Neighbors who heard screaming but called it loud TV. Teachers who noticed bruises but accepted explanations of clumsiness. A system designed to give adults the benefit of doubt while children suffered in silence. "I want to see the file," Margaret said, standing up and brushing ceramic dust from her knees. "The complete case file. Mrs. Holloway." "No." The word came out sharper than Margaret intended, carrying decades of suppressed anger and grief. "For 35 years, I've lived with failing Emma Pritchard. I've carried that guilt like a cancer, convincing myself that if I'd acted faster, been more decisive, that little girl would still be alive." She moved to the diner's front window, staring out at the snow-covered street where normal people live normal lives, untouched by the ghosts that haunted others. "But if Emma is somehow still out there, if she's trying to reach me, then maybe my failure isn't finished yet. Maybe there's still something I can do. Chen was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a new note of respect. The file is in my car. But Mrs. Holloway, once we open this door, there's no going back. If Emma Pritchard is somehow connected to these sightings, if there's more to her disappearance than we understood, following that truth could take us places neither of us is prepared to go. Margaret thought of her careful routine, the morning coffee crowd, the evening soup kitchen, the small kindnesses that had become her life's work, all of it designed to create a buffer zone around her heart, protecting her from the kind of devastating failure that had ended her career and nearly broken her spirit. But Emma's face wouldn't leave her alone. The pale girl with prematurely grey hair, asking for soup with heartbreaking politeness, disappearing into impossible spaces. If there was even a chance that Margaret could finally help her, could finally do what she'd failed to do in 1987, then the choice was already made. "Get the file," she said. 20 minutes later, the manila folder lay open on the diner's counter like a wound. Margaret studied crime scene photos of the abandoned trailer, overturned furniture, broken dishes, dark stains on the linoleum that might have been blood. She read witness statements from neighbors who'd heard domestic disturbance but hadn't called police. Saw the coroner's report on Carl Brennan, whose blood alcohol level suggested he'd been drinking heavily before his fatal crash. But it was the school photo of Emma that made Margaret's breath catch. The same serious eyes, the same too-adult expression of someone forced to grow up too fast. And there, barely visible in the photograph, were the first silver threads in the child's dark hair that would become the premature grey Margaret had seen in the alley. "Genetic condition," Chen said, noticing Margaret's focus. "Premature greying runs in some families. The teacher mentioned it in her statement, said Emma was self-conscious about it, that other kids sometimes teased her." Margaret touched the photograph gently. Emma at 7, already marked by genetics and circumstance, already bearing burdens no child should carry. If the girl Margaret had been seeing was real, she'd been wandering for 35 years, still trying to take care of her mother, still hungry and cold and alone. "There's something else," Chen said, pulling out a map marked with red ink. "Carl's truck crashed here, 5 miles from the trailer. But look at this." She traced a line with her finger. "That route doesn't make sense if he was fleeing town. He was heading deeper into the woods, toward the old mining area." Margaret studied the map, her social worker instincts engaging despite the years. He was going somewhere specific, somewhere he knew. "That's what I think too." "And Mrs. Holloway?" Chen met her eyes. "I don't believe Emma Pritchard died in 1987. I think someone wanted us to believe she did." The diner fell silent except for the wind rattling the windows. Margaret felt the last of her careful isolation crumble away, replaced by something she hadn't felt in decades: purpose. The frightened, guilty woman who'd spent 35 years hiding behind coffee and small talk was stepping aside, making room for the protector she'd once been. "Then we find out what really happened," Margaret said. "We find out why she keeps coming back." Outside, snow continued falling on Millbrook's secrets, but inside the diner, 2 women prepared to dig until they found the truth. The next morning brought more than just fresh snow. It brought visitors Margaret hadn't expected. She was brewing the first pot of coffee when Dorothy Martinez pushed through the diner's front door, followed by Tom Bradley from the hardware store and Father McKenna from St. Catherine's. "We need to talk," Dorothy announced, settling into her usual booth with the authority of someone who'd been holding court in Millbrook for 7 decades. The others flanked her like reluctant lieutenants. Margaret poured coffee without being asked, her social worker instincts reading the room's tension. This wasn't a casual breakfast gathering. "What's on your minds?" "Detective Chen was asking questions yesterday," Tom said, fidgeting with his cup. "About the old Pritchard case. People are talking." "People are worried," Dorothy corrected, her sharp eyes fixed on Margaret. "About you." The coffee pot trembled slightly in Margaret's hand. "Worried how?" Father McKenna leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Margaret, we know you've been under stress. The anniversary of Robert's death. This brutal winter, running the soup kitchen alone, it's natural for grief to manifest in unusual ways. They think I'm having a breakdown, Margaret realized, setting the pot down harder than necessary. Because I told Detective Chen I've seen Emma Pritchard. The silence that followed confirmed her suspicions. These people, who'd become the closest thing she had to family, had come to stage an intervention based on second-hand gossip and small-town concern masquerading as care. The Pritchard girl died 35 years ago, Dorothy said gently. Whatever you think you're seeing, I know what I saw. Margaret's voice carried steel she hadn't accessed in years, and more importantly, Detective Chen believes there's more to Emma's disappearance than anyone understood. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Margaret, Chen's new here. She doesn't understand how things work in Millbrook. Some cases are better left alone. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Better left alone. A 7-year-old child disappeared, Tom. Her mother vanished without a trace. When exactly is it acceptable to stop looking for answers? When those answers won't bring anyone back, Father McKenna said quietly. When digging up the past only causes more pain. Margaret stared at the three faces arrayed before her. People she'd served coffee to for years, who'd supported her through Robert's death, who'd helped her transform his diner into something meaningful. Now they sat in judgment, unified in their desire to contain her grief within acceptable boundaries. You want me to let it go, she said. Pretend I haven't seen anything. Stop asking questions. Return to being the harmless widow who pours coffee and doesn't make waves. We want you to be safe, Dorothy replied. We want you to take care of yourself, instead of chasing ghosts that might destroy what peace you've found. Before Margaret could respond, the diner's bell chimed again. Detective Chen entered, shaking snow from her coat, carrying a leather satchel that looked heavy with purpose. She took in the tableau at the booth. 3 concerned citizens surrounding Margaret like an informal tribunal. Mrs. Holloway, Chen said, nodding politely to the others. I have those additional files you requested, from the State Archives. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tom cleared his throat. Detective, perhaps you should know that Mrs. Holloway has been under considerable stress lately. Has she? Chen's tone remained professionally neutral, but Margaret caught the warning glint in her eyes. She seems remarkably clear-headed to me. In fact, her insights into the Pritchard case have been invaluable. Dorothy's coffee cup clinked against its saucer. What insights could there possibly be? That case was investigated thoroughly 35 years ago. Chen opened her satchel and withdrew a thick file folder. Actually, Mrs. Martinez, that's not entirely accurate. The investigation was closed prematurely due to jurisdictional issues and budgetary constraints. Several leads were never pursued. What leads? Father McKenna asked, though his tone suggested he didn't want to know. Witnesses who were never interviewed. Physical evidence that was never processed. Financial records that might explain how a woman with no resources could simply vanish. Chen's gaze moved between the 3 visitors. It's interesting how eager people are to accept the simplest explanation, even when it doesn't fit the facts. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward the detective. Chen was providing her with something she'd lost years ago, an ally in the pursuit of truth, someone who understood that some questions demanded answers regardless of the cost. The past should stay buried, Tom muttered, standing abruptly. Some stones are better left unturned. But Margaret was already reaching for the new files, her decision crystallizing. These people meant well, but they represented the same willful blindness that had failed Emma Pritchard 35 years ago. The same desire for comfortable ignorance that allowed children to suffer while adults looked away. No, she said quietly, opening the folder. Some stones need to be turned, even if we don't like what crawls out from underneath. The 3 visitors exchanged glances as Margaret spread the new files across the diner counter, their concern hardening into something closer to alarm. Dorothy Martinez's weathered fingers drummed against the booth's formica surface, a sound like rain on a coffin lid. Margaret, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades in Millbrook. You're making a mistake. But Margaret was already absorbed in the documents Chen had brought: bank records, property deeds, employment histories that painted a picture far more complex than the original investigation had revealed. Diane Pritchard received 3 money orders in the months before she disappeared, she said, running her finger down a list of transactions. Anonymous sender, each for $500. Anonymous benefactor, maybe, Father McKenna suggested, though he sounded unconvinced. Someone helping a struggling mother. Chen shook her head. The money orders were purchased at different locations throughout western Pennsylvania: Pittsburgh, Erie, Altoona. Someone was taking care not to establish a pattern. Tom Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're turning a tragic accident into some kind of conspiracy theory. Next you'll be seeing shadowy figures and cover-ups around every corner. Maybe because they're there, Margaret replied, without looking up from the files. Tom, did you know that Carl Brennan had 2 prior arrests for domestic violence? Both charges were dropped when the victims refused to testify. Ancient history. Did you know he worked seasonal construction for Millbrook Development Corporation, the same company that owned half the rental properties in town, including the trailer park where Diane and Emma lived? The silence that followed felt heavy as cemetery earth. Margaret finally looked up to find 3 faces etched with varying degrees of discomfort and fear. "What are you suggesting?" Dorothy asked quietly. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Margaret said. "I'm reading. I'm asking questions that should have been asked 35 years ago." She pulled out a photocopy of an employment record. Carl wasn't just Diane's abusive boyfriend. He was connected to people with money and influence. People who might have reasons for wanting certain problems to disappear. Father McKenna's coffee grew cold as he stared at the papers scattered across the counter. "Margaret, even if there's truth in what you're implying, what good does it do now? Emma would be 42 years old if she's still alive. Her mother would be in her 60s. Maybe they escaped, maybe they built new lives somewhere safe. Why drag them back into the darkness?" It was Chen who answered. "Because children keep disappearing, Father. Different towns, different decades, but the same pattern: vulnerable families, dropped charges, convenient accidents. If there's a system in place, if powerful people have been covering their tracks for generations, then stopping it matters more than protecting their secrets." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that had been locked since 1987. The frightened, guilt-ridden woman who'd retreated into coffee service and small kindnesses was stepping aside, making room for the fierce protector she'd once been, the one who'd fought for children when no one else would listen. "You're talking about destroying lives," Tom said, his face flushed with anger or fear. "Millbrook Development built this town. They employed half the families here, kept the lights on when the steel mills died. You want to tear all that down chasing ghosts?" "I want to find the truth," Margaret said simply. "If that destroys something built on covering up child abuse and murder, then it deserves to be destroyed." Dorothy stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. At 78, she'd buried 2 husbands and countless friends, had weathered every crisis Millbrook had faced in the past 5 decades. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too much to be easily fooled. "I remember Emma Pritchard," she said. "Quiet little thing with that strange grey hair, always too thin, too careful around adults. I remember thinking someone should do something." She gathered her coat and purse with precise movements. "But I also remember what happened to people who asked too many questions about Millbrook Development. Families who suddenly couldn't get loans, businesses that mysteriously failed inspections, workers who found themselves unemployed for no clear reason." Margaret felt her breath catch. "You're saying there was a deliberate cover-up?" "I'm saying be very careful what stones you turn over, Margaret. Some of them have been holding back avalanches." Dorothy paused at the door, snow swirling around her small frame. "And I'm saying that some people in this town have been keeping secrets for a very long time. They won't appreciate having those secrets threatened." The door closed behind her with a finality that felt like a warning. Tom and Father McKenna followed without another word. Leaving Margaret and Chen alone with the scattered files and the weight of implications, neither was quite ready to voice. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the papers, but her voice was steady. "We're going to need help," Chen nodded grimly. "We're also going to need to be very careful who we trust." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, and Margaret felt as though the entire weight of Millbrook's secrets was pressing down on the diner's roof. She stared at the files spread across the counter, each document a piece of a puzzle that was forming a picture. She wasn't sure she was brave enough to see completely. "The money orders," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone was paying Diane Pritchard to keep quiet about something. Chen nodded, pulling out a magnified photocopy. "Look at the dates. The payments stopped exactly 1 week before she and Emma disappeared." Margaret's social worker instincts, dormant for so many years, suddenly blazed to life with terrifying clarity. She was being silenced, and when the payments stopped working, she couldn't finish the sentence. The diner's phone rang, shrill and insistent. Margaret reached for it automatically, then froze. It was past 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. No one called the diner this late. "Let it ring," Chen said, but Margaret was already lifting the receiver. Holloway's diner. Silence stretched across the line, filled with the sound of breathing that seemed too measured to be natural. Then, a voice she'd heard before, childlike, desperate, achingly familiar. The man with the blue truck came back. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "Emma, where are you?" "He's looking for the papers Mommy hid. The ones about the other children. She told me never to tell, but he's so angry now, and Mommy won't wake up." Chen was gesturing frantically, but Margaret couldn't look away from the receiver. Couldn't it break the connection to this impossible voice that held 35 years of pain? "What papers, sweetheart? Where did your mommy hide them?" "Under the loose board by the window, where she put the money when the men brought it. But I can't reach it anymore, and the cold man is coming closer." The line went dead. Margaret stood frozen, the receiver still pressed to her ear, while Chen stared at her with an expression caught between professional skepticism and dawning horror. "That was her," Margaret whispered. "That was Emma, Mrs. Holloway. People can fake voices." She mentioned papers about other children. "Chen, what if Diane Pritchard wasn't just being paid to keep quiet about her own abuse? What if she knew about a whole network, and that's why they had to disappear?" Chen was already reaching for her coat. "Even if that's true, even if somehow a 7-year-old girl has been calling you from beyond the grave, how does that help us find evidence from 1987? Margaret felt her world tilt sideways as the full implications crashed over her. The careful life she'd built, the safe routine that had protected her from exactly this kind of devastating responsibility, was crumbling away like snow in a sudden thaw. But underneath, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the fierce, protective fury that had once made her willing to fight anyone who threatened a child. "Because she told us where to look," Margaret said, grabbing her own coat. "The trailer park, the abandoned one where they found Carl's blood. That area's been condemned for years. It's not safe, especially in this weather. Then we go now, before someone else gets there first." Margaret's voice carried an authority that surprised them both. "Chen, Dorothy Martinez just told us that people in this town have been keeping deadly secrets for 35 years. If Emma's trying to help us find evidence that could expose them, how long do you think we have before they realize what we're doing?" As if summoned by her words, headlights swept across the diner's front windows. A large SUV with tinted windows drove slowly past, its occupants invisible behind the glass. It continued down the street, turned around at the end of the block, and drove past again, slower this time. Chen's hand moved instinctively to her service weapon. "How many people knew I was bringing you those files?" "Just us," Margaret said, then stopped. "And whoever might have been listening when you mentioned them to Dorothy, Tom, and Father McKenna." The SUV passed a third time and parked across the street, its engine still running, exhaust visible in the frigid air. Margaret felt 35 years of guilt and regret crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous: determination. The frightened woman who'd spent decades hiding from her failures was gone, replaced by someone who'd finally found a chance at redemption no matter the cost. "We're not safe here," she said, moving toward the diner's back exit. "And if there really are papers hidden in that trailer, we're running out of time to find them." Chen followed, but her voice carried a note of desperate warning. "Mrs. Holloway, if we're right about this, if there really is a cover-up that's lasted this long, then the people behind it have already killed to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to do it again." Margaret paused at the back door, her hand on the knob, and thought of Emma's voice on the phone. Still frightened, still trying to protect her mother after 35 years of wandering in the cold. "Then we better make sure we find the truth before they find us." The back door of the diner opened onto an alley that felt like stepping into a frozen hell. The wind cut through Margaret's coat as if it were made of paper, and the snow had accumulated into drifts that reached her knees. Behind them, she could hear car doors slamming. The SUV's occupants were no longer content to simply watch. "This way," Chen whispered, leading them toward her patrol car parked behind the building. But as they rounded the corner, Margaret's heart sank. Two figures in dark coats stood beside the vehicle, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. One held what looked like a crowbar, the other was already working on the hood. "Back!" Chen hissed, pulling Margaret deeper into the shadows. "We go on foot." The abandoned trailer park sat on the eastern edge of Millbrook, a 20-minute walk in good weather. Tonight, with the wind howling and the snow falling so heavily that streetlights became useless blurs, it might as well have been on the moon. But they had no choice. The sound of heavy footsteps was already echoing from the alley behind them. They moved through the sleeping town like ghosts, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main streets. Margaret's lungs burned with each breath of the Arctic air, and her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she pushed forward. 35 years of guilt propelled her through the storm, Emma's voice on the phone echoing in her memory. "The cold man is coming closer." "There," Chen gasped, pointing through the swirling snow. The entrance to Pineview Trailer Park loomed ahead, its rusted sign hanging at an angle, half buried in a drift. The place had been condemned for 15 years, ever since a gas leak had forced the evacuation of the last residents. Now it stood like a monument to Millbrook's decay, 47 empty lots slowly being reclaimed by winter and neglect. They stumbled through the broken gate, and Margaret felt time collapse around her. Suddenly she was 47 again, standing in this same spot on a bitter February morning in 1987, watching crime scene techs process Carl Brennan's blood, while knowing in her gut that Emma and Diane were already beyond help. The guilt she'd carried ever since felt like lead in her chest. "Which trailer?" Chen asked, but Margaret was already moving toward the back corner of the park, following a path carved by memory rather than sight. Lot 47, where the Pritchards had lived their last week of normal life. The trailer itself was gone, removed years ago when the park was condemned, but the concrete foundation remained, partially visible under the accumulating snow. Margaret dropped to her knees beside what had once been the front window, her hands already numb as she began digging through the snow and frozen earth. She said, "Under the loose board by the window," she muttered, more to herself than to Chen. "There has to be something." Her fingers struck wood, a piece of subflooring, warped and rotted but still intact, slightly raised from the foundation. Chen knelt beside her, pulling out her phone's flashlight as Margaret pried at the board with her fingernails. It gave way with a crack that sounded like breaking bones. Underneath, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic garbage bags and duct tape, was a manila envelope. Margaret's hands shook as she pulled it free, not just from the cold but from the magnitude of what they'd found. After 35 years, Emma had finally managed to tell someone where her mother had hidden the truth. But as Margaret began to tear open the plastic, headlights swept across the abandoned park. The SUV had found them. "Run," Chen said, but Margaret couldn't move. She clutched the envelope against her chest like a talisman, thinking of all the years she'd failed to protect the children who'd needed her. This was her chance at redemption, the evidence that could finally give Emma and Diane justice. The SUV's doors slammed. Voices called out through the storm, men's voices, hard and professional. Margaret heard Chen's radio crackle as the detective called for backup, but they both knew help wouldn't arrive in time. "Mrs. Holloway," a familiar voice called through the darkness. Tom Bradley stepped into view, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. His face was grim but not surprised, as if he'd known this moment was inevitable. "You need to put that down and walk away." "You knew," Margaret whispered, the betrayal cutting deeper than the wind. "All these years you knew what happened to them." "I know what happens to people who dig up things that should stay buried," Tom replied. "Just like I know what's going to happen to you if you don't hand over that envelope and forget everything you think you've learned." Margaret looked at Chen, saw the detective's hand hovering near her weapon, saw the impossible odds they faced. 3 men against a 62-year-old woman and a rookie cop in a place where their bodies might not be found until spring. But as she stared at the envelope in her hands, Margaret realized that some things mattered more than survival. Emma had waited 35 years to tell her story. That had to mean something. That had to be worth dying for. Margaret's grip tightened on the envelope, and something inside her crystallized with the clarity of winter ice. The truth she'd been running from for 35 years wasn't about Emma Pritchard at all. It was about herself, about the coward she'd become after that case broke her. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the wind with surprising strength. "I'm not walking away. Not this time." Tom's face twisted with what looked like genuine regret. "Margaret, you don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes deeper than one missing child, deeper than you can imagine." "Then tell me," she demanded, rising to her feet despite Chen's urgent whisper to stay down. "Tell me how deep it goes, Tom. Tell me how many children you've helped disappear over the years." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Margaret watched Tom's expression shift from regret to something harder, more dangerous. But in that moment, she finally understood what had been haunting her all these years. It wasn't guilt over failing Emma. It was the terrible suspicion that she'd been meant to fail. "You knew I'd lose that case," she continued, pieces falling into place with devastating clarity. "You knew Judge Morrison would side with Carl Brennan's lawyers, knew I'd be discredited, forced out of social services. That wasn't bureaucratic incompetence. That was orchestrated." Chen's sharp intake of breath told Margaret the detective was reaching the same horrifying conclusion. "You were set up to fail because you were getting too close to something." Tom's silence was answer enough, but it was one of his companions who spoke, his voice flat and professional. 35 years and she finally figures it out. Too little, too late. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not from the snow, but from the magnitude of what she was understanding. How many social workers before me? How many people who asked the right questions and found themselves suddenly incompetent, suddenly unreliable, suddenly gone? "Margaret, stop," Tom said, but she could hear desperation creeping into his voice. "You think you want the truth, but you don't. Some secrets exist for a reason. Some systems work because they stay hidden. Systems that profit from child trafficking?" The words came out of Margaret's mouth before she'd fully formed the thought, but as soon as she spoke them, she knew they were true. The money orders to Diane, the network of disappearances across Pennsylvania, the powerful families who'd built fortunes while vulnerable children simply vanished. Tom stepped closer, his hand visible on the gun at his hip. "You're talking about destroying everything. Millbrook Development didn't just build this town, it built a dozen towns, employed thousands of families, kept entire communities alive when the mills died. On the backs of murdered children, Margaret spat, and felt something ancient and fierce awakening inside her. The woman who'd once fought impossible battles for impossible cases, who'd believed justice mattered more than comfort or safety or career advancement. Chen moved slightly, positioning herself between Margaret and the two strangers, her own weapon now drawn. "Mrs. Holloway, whatever's in that envelope, we need to get it to people who can act on it." "That's not going to happen," Tom said sadly. "Margaret, I genuinely wish you'd left this alone. You were safe as long as you stayed in your diner, serving coffee and keeping quiet. But this... He gestured toward the envelope. This changes everything. Margaret looked at the package in her hands and realized she was holding more than evidence. She was holding the reason Emma had been reaching out to her across 35 years of death. Not for justice, not for revenge, but for this moment. This choice between the safety of ignorance and the terrible burden of truth. Emma knew, she whispered, understanding flooding through her like ice water. She knew I was the one person who'd understand what this meant, because I was already part of the story. The wind died suddenly, creating a pocket of eerie silence in the abandoned trailer park. In that quiet, Margaret could almost hear Emma's voice again, not frightened this time, but urgent, pleading, "Tell them about the others." Margaret looked up at Tom Bradley, the man she'd trusted for decades, the man who'd helped orchestrate her professional destruction, the man who'd probably been reporting on her activities since the day Emma first appeared at the diner. "How long have you been watching me?" she asked. Tom's expression crumpled. "Since you opened the soup kitchen. They wanted to make sure you weren't still investigating." The betrayal should have broken her, but instead it filled Margaret with a cold fury she hadn't felt in decades. She thought of all the children she might have saved if she'd been allowed to keep working, all the families that might have been protected if the system hadn't been rigged from the beginning. "The children in the other towns," she said. "Emma wasn't the first, was she?" Tom's silence told her everything she needed to know. Margaret clutched the envelope tighter and made her choice, the same choice she should have made 35 years ago. "Then it ends tonight." The words hung in the frigid air like a challenge thrown down before fate itself. Margaret felt the weight of 3 decades of cowardice lifting from her shoulders, replaced by something she thought lost forever, the unwavering certainty that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. Tom's face twisted with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "Margaret, you have no idea what you're up against. These people have been protecting their interests since before Emma Pritchard was born. They've outlasted governors, federal investigations, even their own mortality. You think one envelope is going to bring down something that powerful?" "Maybe not," Margaret admitted, backing slowly toward the tree line that bordered the abandoned park. "But Emma didn't spend 35 years trying to reach me so I could give up at the first threat." Chen moved with her, keeping her weapon trained on Tom's companions, while speaking into her radio in urgent clipped tones. But Margaret could hear the doubt in the detective's voice, the growing realization that backup might not be enough, not if this conspiracy reached as deeply into Millbrook's power structure as it seemed to. "The state police," Margaret said suddenly, the plan crystallizing in her mind as they moved. "Chen, your friend at the state police barracks, the one who helped with the missing persons reports. Can we trust her?" "Lieutenant Rodriguez?" "Yes, I think so. But Margaret, we'd have to get there first, and they're not going to let us just walk away." Tom's voice cut through the darkness, closer now. "Margaret, think about what you're doing. You're 62 years old, for God's sake. You've got a quiet life, a successful business. Why throw it all away for ghosts?" The cruel irony of his words struck Margaret like a physical blow. Her successful business was a soup kitchen that barely broke even. Her quiet life was built on decades of self-imposed exile from the work that had given her purpose. She'd been living like a ghost herself, haunting the ruins of her former convictions. "Because some debts can only be paid with the truth," she called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. They'd reached the edge of the park now, where overgrown pine trees provided partial concealment from the swirling snow. Margaret's mind raced through possibilities, discarding each in turn. The main road back to town would leave them exposed. Chen's patrol car was compromised. Tom knew every back route through Millbrook as well as she did. But as they paused in the shadow of an ancient oak, Margaret remembered something else. Something that had nothing to do with roads or cars or conventional escape routes. "The railroad tracks," she whispered to Chen. "The old freight line that runs behind the high school. It connects to the main line about 2 miles north of town, right past the state police barracks." Chen stared at her in the dim light. "Mrs. Holloway, those tracks haven't been maintained in years. In this storm, on foot? It's the only route they won't expect, Margaret insisted, and she was already moving, following half-remembered paths from her childhood when these same woods had seemed like an adventure rather than a potential tomb. Behind them, she could hear Tom organizing his search, spreading his men out to cover the obvious escape routes. But he'd forgotten something crucial about Margaret Holloway. Before she'd been a broken social worker hiding behind a diner counter, she'd been a Millbrook girl who'd spent her youth exploring every secret trail and abandoned path in these hills. The railway cut appeared through the trees like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. The tracks stretched into the darkness, parallel steel lines disappearing into the storm but pointing north, toward safety, toward help, toward the possibility that Emma's sacrifice might finally mean something. Margaret clutched the envelope tighter and felt something she hadn't experienced in 35 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the fierce, purposeful hope of someone who'd finally found their fight again. "Emma," she whispered to the wind, "I'm not running away this time." Chen fell into step beside her as they began following the tracks, both women moving with new determination despite the bitter cold. "What exactly do you think is in that envelope?" Margaret considered the question as they walked, her feet finding the familiar rhythm of railroad ties beneath the snow. "Names," she said finally. "Dates, payments. Enough evidence to prove that what happened to Emma and Diane wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something bigger, something that's been feeding on vulnerable children for decades." The implications settled around them like the falling snow, heavy and inescapable. But for the first time since Emma's pale face had appeared outside her diner window, Margaret felt like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. The tracks stretched ahead through the darkness, carrying them toward whatever came next. Behind them, the abandoned trailer park grew smaller and more distant, but Margaret could swear she heard something in the wind, a child's voice, no longer frightened but grateful, finally being heard after 35 years of silence. The railroad tracks stretched endlessly ahead, each step forward feeling like a commitment Margaret couldn't take back. The envelope crinkled against her chest where she tucked it inside her coat, its presence both a comfort and a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. "How much farther?" Chen asked, her breath coming in sharp puffs that dissipated instantly in the wind. Margaret squinted through the snow, trying to recognize landmarks in the darkness. "Maybe another mile. The state police barracks sits right where the freight line intersects Route 119. But even as she spoke, doubts gnawed at her resolve. What if Lieutenant Rodriguez wasn't on duty? What if the corruption Chen had uncovered in Millbrook extended to the state level? What if they were walking into another trap, trading one set of enemies for another? The questions multiplied with each step, but Margaret forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, she occasionally glimpsed flashlight beams cutting through the forest, evidence that Tom's men were following but hadn't yet thought to check the old rail line. That advantage wouldn't last forever. "Mrs. Holloway," Chen said quietly, "what you said back there about being set up to fail, do you really think it goes back that far?" Margaret's foot caught on a loose rail tie, and she stumbled before catching herself. The near fall jarred loose a memory she'd been trying to suppress for 35 years. Judge Morrison's face, when he'd dismissed her concerns about Emma's safety the way he'd looked through her rather than at her, as if her professional opinion carried no weight at all. "I think it goes back farther than either of us wants to imagine," she said finally. "Emma's case wasn't the beginning. It was just where I finally noticed the pattern." The wind picked up, driving snow into their faces and making conversation nearly impossible. Margaret pulled her scarf tighter and tried to focus on the rhythmic crunch of their footsteps, the steady progress toward safety. But her mind kept drifting to the children she'd tried to save over the years, the cases that had been mysteriously reassigned or dismissed, the families who'd disappeared overnight without explanation. How many times had she told herself it was just bureaucratic incompetence? How many red flags had she ignored because acknowledging them would have meant confronting something too vast and terrible to fight? "There," Chen said suddenly, pointing ahead through the swirling snow. I can see the lights. The state police barracks emerged from the darkness like a beacon, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the storm. Margaret felt her pace quicken despite her exhaustion, hope pulling her forward across the final 100 yards of track. But as they approached the building's rear parking lot, Chen's radio crackled to life. The voice that emerged was distorted by static, but Margaret caught enough words to make her blood run cold. Subjects last seen heading north. Consider armed and dangerous. Approach with caution. Chen yanked the radio from her belt and switched it off, her face pale in the reflected light from the barracks windows. "They're spinning it," she said. "Making us sound like the criminals." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to the envelope inside her coat. The evidence they carried might be worthless if Tom's people controlled the narrative, if every law enforcement agency in the region received word that Margaret Holloway was a delusional old woman and Detective Chen was compromised. "What now?" she asked. But Chen was already moving toward the building's entrance, determination replacing doubt on her face. "Now we find out who we can trust," the detective said, "because backing down isn't an option anymore." The warmth hit them like a wall as they pushed through the barracks' front doors, bringing immediate relief, but also a strange sense of vulnerability. They'd left the familiar darkness of the storm for fluorescent brightness that seemed to expose every secret, every desperate gamble they'd made to reach this moment. The desk sergeant looked up with professional curiosity that quickly shifted to concern as he took in their appearance. Two women, clearly exhausted, clothes torn and faces flushed from the cold. "Can I help you?" "We need to speak with Lieutenant Rodriguez," Chen said, producing her badge with a hand that trembled slightly. "It's urgent. Life or death urgent." Margaret watched the sergeant's face, searching for any sign of recognition, any indication that he'd already received word about them. But his expression remained neutral, professional, as he reached for his phone. "Rodriguez is in her office," he said. "End of the hall, last door on the right." As they walked down the corridor, Margaret felt the weight of 35 years pressing against her shoulders. Every choice she'd made since Emma first appeared at the diner had led to this moment, this final commitment to see the truth through regardless of consequences. The envelope crinkled softly against her chest as she raised her hand to knock on Lieutenant Rodriguez's door, and Margaret realized there was no turning back now. Whatever came next, whatever price had to be paid, Emma Pritchard would finally have her voice. Margaret's knuckles had barely touched the door when it swung open, revealing a compact woman with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. Lieutenant Rodriguez took in their bedraggled appearance with a quick, assessing glance before stepping aside to let them enter. "Detective Chen," Rodriguez said, closing the door firmly behind them. "I've been expecting you." Margaret's heart lurched. "Expecting us?" Rodriguez moved to her desk, where multiple manila folders lay spread across the surface alongside a steaming cup of coffee that suggested she'd been working through the night. "I received an interesting call about an hour ago from someone claiming you two were dangerous fugitives. Given that I've known Detective Chen for 3 years, and she's never shown anything but exemplary judgment, I decided to wait and hear your version first." Chen sagged with relief, but Margaret remained tense. Trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford, not when every ally had the potential to become another trap. "Lieutenant," Chen began, "we have evidence of a conspiracy involving child trafficking, official corruption and murder that goes back decades. But we need someone with the authority to act on it, someone we can trust absolutely." Rodriguez's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hand moved fractionally closer to her service weapon. "That's quite an accusation. What kind of evidence?" This was the moment Margaret had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Everything depended on what happened next, on whether the contents of the envelope would be seen as proof or the ravings of a guilt-obsessed woman who'd lost touch with reality. She reached inside her coat, feeling Rodriguez's attention focus on the movement with laser intensity. The envelope emerged wrinkled but intact, its weight somehow both lighter and heavier than she'd expected. "This was hidden in Diane Pritchard's trailer," Margaret said, placing it carefully on Rodriguez's desk. It documents payments, locations, names, everything needed to prove that Emma Pritchard and her mother weren't random victims of domestic violence, but casualties of something much larger. Rodriguez picked up the envelope with careful, professional hands, but Margaret noticed she positioned herself so both women remained in her line of sight. Trust but verify, the instinct of someone who'd learned to survive in a world where allies could become enemies without warning. The lieutenant's face remained impassive as she examined the envelope's contents, but Margaret watched for tells, the slight widening of her eyes, the way her breathing changed rhythm, the unconscious tightening of her jaw as the implications became clear. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered finally, and Margaret knew they'd found their ally. "How extensive is this?" the lieutenant asked, still scanning through what appeared to be multiple pages of documentation. "We think it spans multiple counties, possibly the entire state," Chen said. Millbrook Development was just one front organization. The trafficking network used construction projects, foster care placements, even charitable foundations as cover. Rodriguez set the papers down with deliberate care, as if they might detonate. "And you believe local law enforcement has been compromised?" "The police chief tried to have us killed tonight," Margaret said bluntly. "Tom Bradley, someone I trusted for 30 years, was part of it from the beginning. They've been watching me since I opened the soup kitchen, making sure I didn't start investigating again." The lieutenant's expression hardened. "How many other children?" It was the question Margaret had been afraid to ask herself, the calculation she'd been avoiding because the answer would make the weight of her past failures unbearable. But now, faced with Rodriguez's direct stare, she forced herself to consider the scope of what they'd uncovered. "Based on what we've found so far? Dozens, maybe hundreds, over the course of 40 years. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush them all. Rodriguez stood and moved to her window, looking out at the storm that showed no signs of abating. When she turned back, her face carried the grim determination of someone who'd just accepted an impossible burden. "We're going to need federal involvement," she said. "This is beyond what state police can handle alone. FBI, U.S. Attorney's Office, possibly a joint task force with multiple agencies." Margaret felt something inside her chest loosen for the first time in hours, the cautious beginning of hope that justice might actually be possible. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Before we make those calls, I need you both to understand something. Once we start this process, there's no stopping it. People are going to fight back, and they're going to fight dirty. Your lives, your reputations. Everything you care about becomes a target." Margaret thought of Emma's pale face, of 35 years of carrying the weight of failure, of all the children who'd been failed by a system designed to protect them. "Lieutenant," she said quietly, "some fights are worth having, regardless of the cost." Rodriguez nodded slowly, reaching for her phone. "Then let's give Emma Pritchard her voice." The door to Rodriguez's office exploded inward before the lieutenant could complete her first call. Tom Bradley burst through the splintered frame, his service weapon drawn, and his face twisted with desperation that had replaced any pretense of reasonable authority. Behind him, Margaret glimpsed 2 other men she didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers who moved with military precision. "Step away from the phone, Rodriguez," Tom commanded, his voice carrying the brittle edge of someone who'd already crossed too many lines to turn back. "And slide those documents over here." Slowly. The lieutenant's hand froze over her desk phone, her eyes calculating distances and odds with the cool assessment of someone who'd faced armed confrontations before. But Margaret could see the terrible mathematics of their situation. 3 armed men, 1 exit, and evidence that represented the only hope of justice for countless dead children. "Tom," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "it's over. Even if you take these documents, copies exist. People know what we've found." His laugh was bitter, desperate. "You always were too naive for your own good, Margaret. You think this is about documents, about evidence. This is about survival, mine, and a lot of other people's who've invested 35 years in keeping this buried." Chen's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her weapon, but one of Tom's men spotted the motion and shifted his aim toward her. Don't, he said quietly. We're not here to hurt anyone unnecessarily, but we will if we have to. Rodriguez's phone began to ring, a shrill sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Everyone's eyes fixed on the device as if it might explode, the possibility of federal reinforcements suddenly hanging in the balance of whether someone answered that call. "Margaret," Tom said, his voice taking on the cajoling tone she remembered from their friendship, from the man who'd comforted her after her husband's death. "You're 62 years old. You've paid enough. Take Detective Chen and walk away. Disappear. We'll arrange new identities, relocation, enough money to start over somewhere warm where nobody knows your name." The offer hung in the air like poisoned honey. Margaret could see its appeal, an escape from the crushing weight of guilt she'd carried for decades, a chance to live whatever years remained, without the constant echo of Emma's voice asking for help that had come too late. But as she stared at Tom's face, she realized she was looking at the man who'd orchestrated her failure 35 years ago, who'd made sure her reports never reached the right people, who'd ensured Emma remained in harm's way until the winter night when everything went wrong. The friend who'd held her while she wept over her professional failures had been the architect of those failures all along. "You son of a bitch," she whispered, the words carrying 35 years of self-recrimination that was finally finding its proper target. "You made me think it was my fault. All these years, I thought I'd failed Emma, but you—" "I protected this community," Tom snapped, his mask of reasonableness finally slipping completely. "Do you have any idea how many people depend on the jobs, the development, the economic activity that network generated? How many families would have starved if bleeding hearts like you had shut it down?" The phone stopped ringing, leaving behind a silence that felt like a held breath. Rodriguez's eyes met Margaret's across the desk, and in that glance, Margaret saw a question and an answer both. "Are you ready to fight?" Everything slowed to crystalline clarity. Margaret could see Chen's muscles coiling for action, could feel Rodriguez preparing to move, could sense the exact moment when talking would end and violence would begin. Tom's desperation had backed him into a corner where witnesses became liabilities, where the only solution was elimination. But in that stretched second before chaos erupted, Margaret heard something else, a child's voice, faint but clear, whispering words that might have been imagination but felt like absolution. "Thank you for not giving up." Emma's face flashed through her mind, not pale and desperate as she'd appeared at the diner, but peaceful. Finally at rest because someone had chosen to fight for the truth. All the children who'd been failed by the system, all the voices that had been silenced, they were depending on what happened in this room in the next few seconds that would determine whether justice was possible or whether the machinery of corruption would grind on for another generation. Margaret's hand closed around the heavy snow globe on Rodriguez's desk, a paperweight that suddenly felt like a weapon, like 35 years of rage and guilt finally finding proper focus. "Emma," she said aloud, her voice cutting through the tension like a prayer, "this one's for you." Then she hurled the globe at Tom's gun hand with all the strength of a woman who'd finally found her fight, and the room exploded into chaos. The snow globe struck Tom's wrist with a sharp crack, sending his weapon skittering across the polished floor. In the split second that followed, Margaret saw everything with terrible clarity, Rodriguez diving for cover behind her desk, Chen lunging toward the nearest gunman, Tom's face contorting with rage and desperation as he scrambled for his fallen pistol. But Margaret's attention fixed on something else entirely, a pale figure standing in the shattered doorway that none of the armed men seemed to see. Emma Pritchard, no longer the desperate child begging for scraps, but something luminous and purposeful, her grey-streaked hair flowing like winter mist. "You have to choose," Emma said, her voice somehow audible above the chaos of shouting voices and struggling bodies. "You can save them, or you can save yourself, but not both." Margaret understood with crystalline certainty what the choice meant. The evidence scattered across Rodriguez's desk would disappear if Tom's men regained control. Chen and Rodriguez would die, their bodies found days later with some fabricated story about a domestic dispute gone wrong. The machinery of corruption would grind on, and dozens of children already dead would remain unavenged while future victims fell into the same dark machinery. Tom's fingers closed around his weapon's grip. One of his men had Chen pinned against the wall, while the other kept Rodriguez trapped behind her desk with sustained gunfire. In seconds, the brief chaos Margaret had created would resolve into their defeat. But Emma was still watching her, still waiting for the choice. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she lunged not for safety but toward Tom Bradley. 62 years old, arthritic joints screaming protest, but driven by something beyond physical limitation, the accumulated weight of every child she'd failed to save. Every case that had been mysteriously reassigned, every night she'd lain awake wondering if she could have done more. Tom saw her coming and tried to bring his weapon up, but Margaret's desperate tackle caught him off balance. They crashed into Rodriguez's filing cabinet with bone-jarring force, and Margaret felt something in her shoulder give way with a pop of tearing cartilage. Pain exploded through her left arm, but she held on to Tom with grim determination, her good hand clawing for his gun. He outweighed her by 50 pounds and had 30 years less wear on his frame, but Margaret had something he lacked, the absolute conviction that comes from finally understanding the true cost of failure. "You destroyed my life," she gasped, her fingernails raking across his face as they struggled. "Made me think I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't strong enough to save them." Tom's elbow caught her in the ribs, driving the breath from her lungs, but Margaret's grip on his weapon never loosened. Through the ringing in her ears, she could hear Chen and Rodriguez fighting their own desperate battles, could smell gun smoke and fear and the metallic tang of blood. Those children were never going to be saved, Tom snarled, his face inches from hers. They were already damaged goods. At least our way, they served a purpose, generated revenue, kept important people happy. The casual dismissal of Emma's life, of all the children's lives, sent a surge of fury through Margaret that transcended physical pain. She drove her knee upward with all the strength she could muster, and Tom's gasp of agony gave her the opening she needed. Margaret wrenched the gun from his grip, but before she could bring it to bear, she felt a strange coldness spreading through her chest. Looking down, she saw the handle of a knife protruding from between her ribs, Tom's backup weapon that he'd drawn, while she focused on the gun. The weapon fell from nerveless fingers as Margaret slumped against the filing cabinet. Warmth spread down her shirt front, and she could taste copper on her tongue. Tom was already reaching for his pistol, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. But Chen had broken free from her attacker, and Rodriguez had emerged from cover with deadly purpose. The remaining gunmen fell within seconds, professional precision overwhelming desperate violence. Margaret watched it all through vision that was starting to grey at the edges. She could feel her heartbeat growing irregular, could sense her body's systems beginning their final shutdown. But the evidence remained, scattered across Rodriguez's desk, undamaged and waiting for the phone calls that would finally bring justice. Emma knelt beside her, no longer pale and desperate, but radiant with something that might have been peace. "Thank you," the child whispered, her small hand somehow warm against Margaret's cooling cheek. "Thank you for choosing us." Margaret tried to speak, to tell Emma she was sorry it had taken so long, sorry she hadn't been strong enough 35 years ago. But her voice was failing along with everything else. Rodriguez was already on the phone, calling for medical assistance and federal backup. Chen pressed her jacket against Margaret's wound, applying pressure with grim determination, but Margaret could see in their faces that they knew, just as she did, what the choice had ultimately cost. She'd saved them, saved the evidence, saved all the children who might have been taken if the network had continued operating. The price was everything she had left to give. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their boots echoing through the storm-damaged police station as they worked with practiced efficiency over Margaret's still form. Rodriguez watched from beside her desk, her hands steady despite the blood on her uniform, while Chen maintained pressure on the wound until the medical team could take over. "She's lost a lot of blood," the lead paramedic said, his voice professionally neutral as he established an 4-line. "Pulse is weak and thready. We need to move now." Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness as they transferred her to the gurney, catching fragments of radio chatter about federal agents en route, evidence preservation, and a crime scene that would take days to process completely. But what struck her most was the absence of Emma's presence. No pale figure hovering at the edge of her vision, no whispered words about choices and redemption. For the first time in 35 years, Margaret felt truly alone. But it wasn't the crushing solitude of failure she'd carried for decades. This was different. The clean emptiness that comes after a debt has finally been paid in full. Rodriguez rode with her in the ambulance, holding the envelope of evidence like a sacred trust. "Federal task force is mobilizing," she said, leaning close so Margaret could hear over the siren's wail. "FBI, State Attorney General's Office, U.S. Marshals. This is going to be the biggest corruption investigation Pennsylvania's seen in decades." Margaret tried to nod, but the effort sent fresh pain through her chest. The knife had missed her heart by inches, but it had found something vital nonetheless. She could feel her body's systems struggling, could sense the careful balance tipping toward inevitable conclusion. "The children," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the road noise. "We'll find them all," Rodriguez promised. "Every case, every missing person report that got buried. Tom's files are being seized as we speak. Chen's coordinating with social services to identify any current victims." Through the ambulance's rear window, Margaret watched Millbrook's snow-covered streets slide past. The storm was finally breaking, revealing glimpses of dawn between the clouds. By the time the sun fully rose, the network that had operated in darkness for 4 decades would be exposed to federal scrutiny. At the hospital, Margaret drifted through surgery in a haze of anesthesia and pain medication. When she finally surfaced to something approaching consciousness, Chen was sitting beside her bed, looking exhausted but grimly satisfied. 47 arrests so far, the detective reported quietly, including 3 judges, 2 state legislators, and half the county planning commission. The FBI found records going back to 1978, names, locations, financial transactions, everything needed for prosecution. Margaret's throat felt raw from the breathing tube, but she managed to croak out a single word. "Emma?" Chen's expression softened. "We found her, Margaret. Found them both. Diane Pritchard's body was buried on construction sites, 4 different locations over the years. Emma..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Emma was never buried properly. They dumped her in a quarry outside town, weighted down like she was garbage instead of a 7-year-old child who deserved better." The news should have brought closure, but Margaret felt only a deep, bone-weary sadness. Even in death, Emma had been denied dignity, denied the simple recognition that her young life had mattered to someone. "But that's changing," Chen continued. "The FBI's treating every victim as a federal case. Full investigations, proper burials, victim compensation for surviving family members. Emma's going to have a headstone that lists her real name, her real age, not the lies they told to cover up what they did." Over the following days, as Margaret moved between surgery and recovery, the scope of their discovery became clear. The trafficking network had operated across 3 states, using legitimate businesses as fronts while moving vulnerable children through a system designed to exploit rather than protect them. Construction projects, foster care placements, charitable foundations, all had been corrupted to serve the network's purposes. Rodriguez visited regularly, updating Margaret on the federal investigation's progress. Asset seizures, witness cooperation, plea bargains that revealed even deeper layers of corruption. The evidence from Diane Pritchard's trailer had provided the foundation, but investigators were uncovering decades of institutional failure that reached into state government. "Tom Bradley's talking," Rodriguez reported during one visit. "Trying to cut a deal by providing information about higher-level conspirators. Turns out the corruption went all the way to the state capitol." Margaret listened to each update with growing exhaustion that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. Justice was finally possible, but it came too late for Emma, too late for dozens of other children whose names were emerging from seized files like ghosts demanding recognition. On the fifth day, as winter sunlight streamed through her hospital window, Margaret understood that her work was truly finished. The machinery of justice had taken over, federal prosecutors and investigators picking up the burden she'd carried alone for so long. Emma's voice was finally being heard, not through desperate whispers in a failing diner, but through courtrooms and grand jury proceedings that would ensure accountability. The debt was paid. The choice had been made. And for the first time since 1987, Margaret Holloway could rest. 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the doorway of Harold's diner, her left arm still bound in a sling, watching Rodriguez sweep the last of the broken glass into a dustpan. The federal investigation had moved beyond her small soup kitchen, but the damage remained: overturned tables, smashed windows, and the lingering smell of violence that seemed to have seeped into the very walls. "You don't have to do this yourself," Rodriguez said, looking up from her work. "The FBI's Victim Compensation Fund would cover professional restoration." Margaret shook her head, wincing slightly at the movement. "Harold built this place with his own hands. If it's going to serve people again, I need to be part of putting it back together." The past 3 weeks had transformed more than just her physical body. The woman who'd spent decades carrying guilt like a stone in her chest had been replaced by someone harder, cleaner, still wounded, but no longer bleeding internally from old failures. The knife wound would heal. The deeper injuries had already begun to close. Chen emerged from the kitchen carrying a box of salvageable supplies. "Forensics team cleared the building this morning. You're officially free to reclaim it." She paused, studying Margaret's face. "You sure you want to reopen? After everything that happened here?" "Especially because of everything that happened here," Margaret replied. She moved carefully to the counter where Emma had first appeared, her hand tracing the scarred wood surface. This is where she finally found her voice, where the truth started coming out. Harold would want it to keep serving people. The federal investigation had indeed reached into every corner of the corruption network, just as Rodriguez had promised. Tom Bradley's cooperation had led to indictments reaching the state capitol, while seized records revealed a systematic pattern of abuse spanning 40 years. 17 children's remains had been recovered and properly buried, their names restored to dignity. But for Margaret, the most profound change wasn't in the headlines or courthouse proceedings. It was in the silence inside her own mind, the absence of Emma's desperate voice, replaced by something that felt like peace. The child had finally found rest, and so had the woman who'd failed to save her. "I have something for you," Rodriguez said, reaching into her jacket. She withdrew a small, framed photograph. Emma Pritchard at age 7, smiling at the camera with bright eyes and no grey in her dark hair. FBI found it in Diane's belongings. "Thought you should have it." Margaret accepted the photograph with trembling fingers, studying the child's face without the overlay of desperation she'd grown accustomed to. This was Emma as she'd lived, not as she'd died, innocent, hopeful, deserving of protection that had come too late but had finally arrived. "There's something else," Chen added quietly. "We found records of other children who survived. Kids who escaped before." She gestured vaguely. "Social services is working to contact them, offer counseling, support services. Your testimony helped them understand how deep this went." The idea that some had survived, had gone on to build lives beyond the network's reach, brought Margaret unexpected comfort. Not every story had ended in quarries and unmarked graves. Some of the children she'd tried to help had found safety, even when she couldn't provide it herself. Rodriguez finished collecting the broken glass and stood, brushing dust from her uniform. "The soup kitchen license is still valid. Health department says they'll fast-track the inspection once you're ready to serve food again." She paused. "But Margaret, you don't owe anyone anything anymore. You've paid enough." Margaret considered this as she looked around the damaged dining room. The guilt that had driven her for 35 years was gone, replaced by something different. Not obligation, but choice. The freedom to help because she wanted to, not because she was desperately trying to atone for imagined failures. "I know," she said finally. But hungry people don't stop being hungry because the case is closed. And this place. She gestured to encompass Harold's legacy, Emma's final moments, and all the meals that had provided warmth in the depths of winter. This place is about more than guilt now. It's about keeping faith with the living. Outside, Millbrook was beginning to thaw. The harshest winter in 50 years was finally breaking, revealing a landscape scarred but not destroyed. Federal funds would help rebuild what corruption had undermined, while new oversight systems promised to protect the vulnerable in ways that hadn't existed before. Margaret picked up a broom and began sweeping around the counter where Emma had stood, where a 7-year-old ghost had finally found the adult willing to fight for her truth. The work was different now. Not penance, but purpose. Not desperation, but hope. For the first time since Harold's death, Margaret Holloway was home. The new beginning. 6 months later, Margaret ladled soup into a bowl and handed it across the counter to Mrs. Chen, not the detective, but an elderly woman who'd been coming every Tuesday since the diner reopened. The lunch rush at Harold's had evolved into something different than before, still serving those who needed it most, but with a warmth that transcended mere survival. "Extra cornbread today," Margaret said, adding 2 pieces to the plate. "It's Harold's recipe, but I think I finally got the proportions right." Mrs. Chen smiled, her weathered hands steady as she accepted the meal. "You always say that, but it's been perfect for months now." The dining room buzzed with quiet conversation, a mix of regulars who'd weathered Millbrook's harsh winter and newer faces drawn by word of mouth about the place where a woman served food with genuine care rather than dutiful obligation. The federal investigation had brought unwanted attention initially, but that had faded as media moved on to other stories. What remained was simply a soup kitchen that felt like what Harold had always intended, a gathering place for people who needed one. Rodriguez appeared at the counter, no longer in uniform but wearing the casual clothes of someone officially off duty, but never truly disconnected from her work. "How's the shoulder feeling?" "Better every day," Margaret said, rolling the joint to demonstrate improved mobility. The physical therapy had been grueling, but she'd approached it with the same steady determination she now brought to everything, not driven by guilt, but by the simple desire to be fully present for whatever came next. "Good, because I have news." Rodriguez accepted a cup of coffee, inhaling the steam. Final sentencing came through today. Tom Bradley got life without parole. 3 of the judges got 25 years minimum. The whole network is finished. Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction, like a book finally being closed after years of searching for the proper ending. Justice had taken time, but it had been thorough. More importantly, the systems that had failed children like Emma were being rebuilt from the ground up, with oversight and transparency that might prevent future tragedies. "Any word on the survivors?" Margaret asked, wiping down the counter with practiced efficiency. "Several are doing well. 2 finished college, one's a nurse now, another teaches elementary school. They wanted me to thank you for not giving up." Rodriguez paused, choosing her words carefully. They said it mattered, knowing that someone kept looking for the truth, even when everyone else wanted to forget. The afternoon light shifted as March snow began falling outside, not the brutal storm of last winter, but gentle flakes that would melt by evening. Margaret watched through windows that Harold had installed decades ago, seeing not the decay that had consumed Millbrook for years, but signs of slow renewal. The federal corruption investigation had led to infrastructure funding, job programs, and investment in schools that had been neglected for too long. A young woman entered, shaking snow from her coat. Margaret didn't recognize her, but something in her posture, careful, assessing, like someone accustomed to evaluating situations for hidden dangers, seemed familiar. "Are you Margaret Holloway?" the woman asked, approaching the counter with hesitant steps. "I am. What can I get you?" "I'm Sarah Morrison. I used to be Sarah Kellerman." She paused, watching for recognition. "You tried to help me in 1985. I was 8 years old, living with my stepfather after my mother died. You came to the house 3 times, filed reports, recommended removal." Margaret felt her breath catch. Sarah had been one of the cases that had been mysteriously reassigned, one of the children she'd wondered about during sleepless nights for decades. Standing before her now was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and steady hands, someone who'd survived and built a life despite institutional failures. "I wanted you to know," Sarah continued, "that even though the system failed, you didn't. I remembered you as the one adult who listened, who believed me when I said I was afraid. That mattered, even when nothing changed immediately." "How did you—" Margaret began, but Sarah smiled. "I got lucky. A teacher noticed bruises, made calls, kept pushing until someone listened. I ended up with a foster family who actually cared. Finished high school, went to college, became a social worker myself." She gestured around the diner. "I heard about what you did exposing the network. I had to come thank you." Margaret reached across the counter, taking Sarah's hands in her own. "I'm sorry it took so long. I should have fought harder back then." "You fought as hard as anyone could within a corrupted system," Sarah replied firmly. "But you never stopped caring, never stopped trying to help people. That's what matters now." As evening settled over Millbrook, Margaret stood in her kitchen, not the diner's kitchen, but her own small apartment above the restaurant where she'd moved after selling her suburban house. Harold's photograph sat on the windowsill, his smiling face catching the last light of day. She no longer heard Emma's voice in the wind, or glimpsed pale figures in her peripheral vision. The child had found peace, and so had the woman who'd finally helped her speak. Margaret Holloway had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes redemption isn't about fixing the past, but about choosing to keep faith with the future, one meal and one moment at a time. Tomorrow would bring new faces, new stories, new opportunities to serve with purpose rather than penance. For the first time in 35 years, that was enough.